Now we are going back to science, or another welcome address, a keynote, presidential keynote address. And it's with great pleasure that I say a few words about Thomas Mehner, a dear colleague and no least the president of SIL. Thomas is a man of many talents and interests. He was born and raised in the German Democratic Republic, completed his university career before the reunification in Germany happened to change all our lives, be it in the East or in the West, and he's a typical Aussie. And it's really an important part of our German biographies, and I leave it up to you to put me in whatever box. I won't out myself today, to which group I belong. I know Thomas as a sharp thinker. He's engaged, he interferes, he gets involved, and beyond his own benefits. And this includes, for instance, his engagement in SIL. And it's a grand task, and thank you very much, Thomas, for doing this. Thomas is a good teacher. He's a family man. He's a reasonable good dancer, but he's a gifted musician. And we can all experience him on stage Tuesday night during the Limnology night, playing with his band. And if you want to learn something about work-life balance, this buzzword I hate so much, don't spend money on worthless workshops. Talk to Thomas. He's the most balanced man I know. At last, giving that title of your presidential address, you also seem to have a soft spot for philosophy, and I'm curious to learn about this part of your personality, and the podium is yours.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Rita, for this nice introduction. Believe 50%, no more. So, dear ambassador, dear friends and colleagues, in the name of the International Society of Limnology and also in my own name, I would like to welcome you warmly to this conference on occasion of the 100th anniversary of our society. In 1922, Ena Naumann and August Thienemann founded the International Society of Theoretical and Applied Limnology. And now, 100 years later, the society is still a vibrant association of researchers and practitioners who are interested in inland waters. And I'm absolutely convinced that the presentations during the next days will show that limnologists engage in mitigating the consequences of these global changes that are more pressing than ever today. This is nicely reflected by the motto, sensing and safeguarding inland waters. However, I would also like to mention, and this is something quite emotional, I'm very happy to see you here assembled in person. After more than 2 years of severe COVID restriction, this is so nice that we will get the chance to talk to each other and even to hug each other. So I wish the conference a continued success. I would like to continue with a presidential keynote that I've entitled Diversity of Research Types and Plurality of Philosophical Concepts in Limnology. One of the typical discussions or exchange of ideas during conferences as ours is whether you consider yourself as a limnologist or an aquatic ecologist. And people who like to say I'm a limnologist often say, well, limnology is the queen of sciences. Limnology is fundamentally multidisciplinary, it's system-oriented, and synthetic. And the ecologists come and say, no, truly scientific is only ecology, because we seek for mechanistic understanding of phenomena. The interesting notion here is that these statements do not tell anything about content of disciplines. but they are fundamentally philosophical. And they talk a little bit about ontology, how things are. They talk about epistemology, how we understand, perceive things, and how we research them, so methodology. And I was thinking maybe people choose their preferred discipline not because of the content, but because of the philosophy behind. And here I refer to the German philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who told people certainly choose their philosophy according to their personality. And I think, and this is the topic of the next 20 minutes, that certainly the diversity of researcher types and plurality of philosophical thinking is a characteristic of limnology. A very fascinating example are the founders of our society. Wilhelm Rode, 50 years ago, has written his personal experiences with our founders. Thienemann was cultured with a deeply rooted intellectual heritage in philosophy, was highly disciplined, balanced, and positive. Naumann, in contrast, was impulsive, energetic, and unpredictable, yet highly original and insightful. At the end, these two together developed a fundamentally new concept, the lake typology. And this typology later has been developed into these famous books, Die Binnengewässer, the Inland Waters, issued by both Naumann and Thienemann. And I was thinking maybe a diversity of characters, a diversity of researcher types could be very important for scientific progress. And subsequently, I will call researchers every person who is involved in research, but also in the management of inland waters. The classification of diversity of researcher types is a very subjective approach. It is my personal experience with researchers I've met during the last 30 years. It does not follow something like a psychology personality definition. What I also will do, I will give some excursions into the history of philosophy. The reason is twice. First, I would like to show that there might be kind of correspondence between some diversity in researcher types and different philosophical concepts. On the other hand, I think it is very important that we start again understanding each other also from the philosophical perspective. And I will close my keynote by the importance of researcher diversity for science and education, and will also have a few words what this could mean for our society. The first researcher type I would like to introduce, I have called the disciplinary specialist. You all know what I mean here. These are the people who are often recognized by the topic the researcher is representing. So it's often told, this is a person measuring greenhouse gases in lakes, instead of naming him. If they are successful, they are very often first or last author of a long number of publications. They are leader of large projects and have huge networks. And because this researcher type is so successful, it is often promoted in the top leading researcher positions as university professors or leaders of huge groups. A philosophical stream that may match to these disciplinary specialists is ontological reductionism. And this is qualified by a statement that every natural phenomenon can be understood by the mechanisms at the smaller, at the subunit states. Methodologically, it is characterized by strict empirical research, analytical approaches are dominant, and we seek for mechanistic interpretation of phenomena. It is fascinating to see that an ecologist, Henry Gleason, has substantially contributed to this stream of thinking, so it has later been taken over also into philosophy. So Gleason was a kind of community ecologist who suggests to study populations to understand communities. The opposite stream is ontological holism. And here again, the qualification statement is the whole is more than the sum of its parts. And we often talk about so-called emergent properties. It was again an ecologist, Frederick Clemens, who suggested that communities are in fact superorganisms with a kind of homeostatic properties. And with respect to the methodology, it is an integrative approach addressing the complexity of the systems. And the researcher type I always connect with holism, although this is of course not a mechanistic link, is someone whom I would call the universalist. I have met a few universalists in my career, but for me, at least, this is a personal impression, this type of research is disappearing. They had a very broad conceptual attitude and a multidisciplinary knowledge. Often they could comprehend interdependencies across many disciplines, and what was characteristic, they were interested in the history of a discipline and also in the history of philosophy. Two more researcher types I have met are first the operational manager and the method expert. The operational manager is often a person repeating experiments, reanalyzing data, reviewing parts of the research. Often responsible for organizing interactions and collaborations. And what I found characteristic, sometimes at least, these were persons feeling a kind of a moral imperative to follow the duties. Ironically, you could call them the eternal deputies. The method expert is also a person you know all. This is an expert in even taxonomy, in statistics, in modeling, analysis, and sometimes with vast graphical skills. And they are always eager to apply the most recent methodological development and apply it every day to run the everyday business. Why do I mention here the two researcher types on the one hand and the other on the other hand? There are two approaches in research we have to consider. One can be summarized as advancement. Advancement means here generation of new hypotheses and predictions. The opposite is validation research. Validation confirms the results obtained from advancement. And there is some similarity with the famous book by Thomas Kuhn on the scientific revolutions. In the context of this book, and often in a discussion, it is assumed that the only true science is advancement. I found a very interesting paper at the beginning of the year by Frédéric Dubois and Pedro Pires-Neto in Transient Ecology and Evolution. They considered the interaction between advancement and validation as a game for public goods. Of course, money, but also appreciation. And if you follow game theory, it simply means there is no single-sided solution. It does not pay off to follow just one strategy, neither for the individual, nor for the group, nor in total for the society. It simply means advancement and validation are part of the same business. We shouldn't give more weight to one over the other. Two more types I would like to mention. The first is the problem solver. The problem solver are people who try to resolve problems that come from the living world, so not from science itself. They want to develop management strategies. They often are intensely engaged in stakeholder interactions. And here, of course, we touch already a different discipline. We come into the humanities. It is very clear if you interact with people, you need to think something about sociology and psychology, for example. This is also clear if we talk about what I called instructors. Instructors are teachers, science communicators, educators and mentors, but also referees and editors of our scientific journals. It is very characteristic that these people often invest a lot of time into service of others. Ideally, the instructors facilitate the development of their learners instead of teaching facts. And here again, it's very clear, this touches sociology and psychology. Here again, we can have a classification and think about what is a background in philosophy. On the one hand, with a disciplinary specialist, the universalist, operational managers, and method experts, this is something what we can summarize under objectivism. So people following this stream say, well, yes, there is an objective reality outside of us, and this objective truth can be discovered and we can develop predictions. However, the last 100 years has also been characterized by quite some discussion, and Jean Piaget is one of the people who have tried to challenge this simple objectivism by a stream that is called constructivism. These people think, yes, of course, the world is independent of human mind, but the knowledge is always a social construction. And this simply means that also learners construct new knowledge through experience and social discourse that puts a strong weight into the individual history of each researcher. And the consequence is that there is no longer a single method that can be applied in research, but a diversity of research methods. And this applies even more to the last researcher type I would like to introduce, whom I have mentioned, or what I would like to call the Dionysian researcher. What is a Dionysian researcher? I became inspired by Friedrich Nietzsche's book, The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music. Nietzsche is referring to the Greek mythology there. And in Greek mythology, Apollo is the god of rational thinking and order, whereas Dionysus is the passionate, emotional, and instinct-driven god. And I mean, it's tempting. It's really tempting to think about the characterization of Thienemann and Naumann here as the opposite characters. What is characteristic for the Dionysian researchers here? Dionysian researchers, in my experience, perceive the objects of their research subjectively and therefore emotionally. They achieve understanding, often initially at least, by introspection and intuition, and sometimes they even have an artistical access to their objects. So they paint, they take photographs, or play music. Here again, the question is, what could be a background in philosophy? And here I have to mention two streams. The fundamental in favor of just empirical research is the positivism. It was the French philosopher Auguste Comte who suggested that research in humanities is nothing else than research in natural sciences, because human behavior just follows the same rules as all what we know from the natural sciences. There has been a massive discussion of this concept, and what is now called anti-positivism, for example, exemplified by Max Weber, says, well, no. Research in humanities should concentrate on cultural norms, values, symbols, and processes seen from an entirely subjective perspective. And therefore, intuition and introspection are fundamentally important for knowledge generation. It is interesting in Thomas Kuhn's Scientific Revolution book, he also mentions that in particular during revolutionary phases of science, the introspection and intuition is of great importance. So the final philosophical thing I would like to mention here is, can we at all achieve scientific truth if we allow scientific and philosophical plurality? Well, it depends on what scientific truth is. According to the pragmatism, and these are the two American founders of pragmatism, Peirce and James, the important point is how effective you can predict phenomena instead of expecting that the scientific truth corresponds with something that is the natural reality. We don't know anything about the natural reality, so we can, in principle, go only for coherence among us. And you may think this is not a very valid conclusion, but in fact it came from evolutionary thinking. Evolutionary thinking in biology, epistemology, in psychology, and ethics have suggested that survival of humans is a sign of effectiveness. What we know about the world, what we feel about the world, must be somehow true and effective in guiding us. And therefore, we survive. So here, a short summary. I think there are researcher types, not necessarily the same for all of you. You may classify people differently. I'm convinced that these types follow consciously or unconsciously different philosophical concepts, and these concepts refer to ontology, epistemology, and the method of science. You can say, well, don't bother me with all that stuff. I'm a pure natural researcher. I don't need philosophy. I have to say this is impossible. You can't do science without philosophizing. Yes. And this is, again, rooted in the book by Thomas Kuhn, saying, well, we work in paradigms, and paradigms include more than just facts. They include ways of looking at the world, practice of instrumentation, research traditions, and even values and beliefs. I will now give 3 totally different examples in which way the philosophical context can be important for interpretation. The first is Darwin's understanding of the mechanisms of natural selection. Many of us think and have been taught that Darwin went on the voyage with a beagle, sampled quite a number of birds, said, wow, these are finches, they are pretty similar, but not all totally similar, and then that he induced from this knowledge on the mechanisms of natural selection. But if you check, Darwin was not an ornithologist. He didn't know that he has sampled finches, which was an ornithologist from London, William Gould, who later told Darwin, yes, these are finches. Darwin also took quite a number of books with him during the voyage, and these were primarily books about humanities. And here, for example, moral philosophy and human population statistics. And in fact, it is very likely that Darwin deduced from rules he had learned from the books to the mechanisms in natural sciences, in nature. And the point here is induction and deduction are different processes. They have to be separated philosophically. There is not a good or bad one, but just it's a different approach, and we should be aware of it. A second very simple example I've taken from the Encyclopedia of Inland Waters, the second edition, that Clement Tockner and I have edited and which has appeared recently. There's a full section on social and societal values of water. And from the chapter of Johns and Stewart, I've taken the importance of considering how indigenous people value water in a way that is not just a resource. Often there is a spiritual link to water, and therefore water has an inherent value. And my philosophical question is, as a strict empiricist, how do you approach this? It is almost impossible. The third example I've taken from a paper by Curry that has been published 4 years ago. Our knowledge should help to come to responsible decisions. And the example what is developed here goes back 50 years ago when many of our lakes became green, so had algal blooms. And it was not clear what the reason is. There were 2 different approaches. On the right-hand side, This is the famous David Schindler experiment. He has divided a lake, fertilized one half, and could induce algal blooms. This is a strictly mechanistic explanation how algal blooms can be caused. On the other side, there was a so-called correlative approach, the correlation between the concentration of phosphorus and the concentration of chlorophyll A as a proxy for algal blooms. And often people say, well, it's just correlation. It's no causation at all. But if you are sitting on a lake, for you, such a correlation might be extremely helpful to understand whether your lake is at the level of being at risk to algal blooms or not. Although it is predictive and correlative, it may help society more than the understanding of a mechanism. Again, I don't say one is better than the other. I just want to say we have different approaches, we have different philosophies, and maybe all are at some point important. So if we want to solve complex real-world problems, then we need a plurality of approaches with respect to concepts, methodology, and reasoning. And normally would say, well, this plurality is brought in by the diversity of individuals, diversity of researcher types. However, we all know that the appreciation of the contribution of these researcher types varies dramatically. The first and senior author papers are more often written by the disciplinary specialists and the universalists, whereas the taxonomists or these experts are often in the middle. And we see something similar with respect to these multidisciplinary studies, that people have enormous difficulties to publish multidisciplinary results in disciplinary journals. And so there is a clear disadvantage. But we all know that promotion of people, of researchers into the top positions follow these paper lists, the first and last author paper lists. And automatically, we have a narrowing down of a broad diversity of philosophical concepts into fewer ones. The next step is, these are often the teachers of a young generation. And again, what is taught is a narrower set of philosophical concepts when desirable. Learners will simply try to copy what we learn. They will say, this is the way to get positions. And instead having a variety of individual talents and a variety of philosophical backgrounds, we will see a canalizing towards a dominant paradigm. And this simply means the social construction of our science system is perpetuated as it is now. It is no longer strictly meritocratic, what we all assume, just based on achievement. But can you imagine that we have a system that would enforce taking philosophical concepts just to be successful? This is nothing what I like to support. So I would say, well, we need a broad diversity of researcher types, and we need a clearer understanding of our philosophical backgrounds to come into interaction and also to change the science system again. Finally, a few words to our society. If we want to follow our mission to promote excellence in studying and managing inland waters and addressing global issues, then we as a society have to define our own understanding how to achieve diversity of researcher types and a plurality of approaches. So I'm absolutely in favor of appreciating individual strengths instead of just counting papers. I also would like to mention that inter- and transdisciplinary approaches to resolving problems from the living world should have equal weight to the empirical research what is normally dominating in limnology. And I'm very much in favor of education and mentorship through facilitation of individual development. How can this be achieved within SOL? I suggest that we rethink in which way we select researchers for our awards and prizes, and also how we select keynote speakers of the international conferences. I'm in favor of expanding educational and mentorship activities of our society. Grassroots team science, led by early career researchers, is one of the options. Interactive method and skill courses, this is something that we have started during the last conferences already. And also our individual mentor-mentee program is something that really could help facilitating the individual development based on the philosophical streams that a researcher likes most and would like to follow. And this also means that our our journal of the Society Inland Waters should cover limnology in a broad aspect, including multidisciplinary studies like humanities and covering systematically also theoretical, conceptual, but also philosophical publications. So my take-home message, I don't think a classification in either a limnologist or aquatic ecologist is a procedure we should follow. We should consider that science is always done by individuals, and individuals have individual experiences and histories. And all these individual histories, perspectives, are worth of similar appreciation. For limnologists and ecologists alike, there is more than one sound way to contribute to research. And this plurality of philosophical concepts is essential for an effective comprehension of the real world. And I would like to close with the words of Thienemann again. This was part of his first introductory speech when SIL was founded. How often one hears the word about the objectivity of science. But science is the work of the individual researcher personalities, and therefore in its genesis can be fully understood only from the peculiarity and the development of its bearers. Any scientific work that rises above the average has a strong personal, that is, subjective note. And it is often this that makes such work particularly interesting. Many thanks for your attention.